What's going on, gamers? We got an interesting interview here by Digital Foundry about the PSSR 2 coverage of Mark Cerny, giving us all the highlights and details that we need. It's definitely interesting on what they're going to be sharing up in there because it wasn't just about PSSR improving image quality. It does more than that, and they're going to explain that. So let's go ahead and get into this. Let me know what you guys think about this. As usual, leave a comment down below, subscribe, become a member if you want. I appreciate that. Other than that, let's see what goodies they have to share. Are we ready? Here we go.
Yes, so we'll get something out there, and obviously you've got our opinions based on what we've seen so far, but it is just like, an hour or two of play, right, John?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay then, but with that, let's move on. Okay, one of the big things that happened this week was, of course, the release finally of the upgraded PSSR, or PSSR 2, as it has been unofficially dubbed, for PlayStation 5 professional consoles. This is quite interesting, right? Because we're suddenly seeing dramatic increases to quality across the board on just about all of the supported games there, which is transformative for this particular machine. Bearing in mind that PSSR 1 was a bit of a mixed bag, shall we say. Some great implementations, some not great implementations, but I think it's fair to say that all games have been improved to varying degrees with the new upscaler. We have actually had the chance to pose some questions to PlayStation lead system architect Mark Cerny, and we've got some interesting insights here into the new technology, stuff that really gives us an insight into, I think, not just what's happening with PSSR, but also maybe a broader view on what's happening with Project Amethyst, where we do generally seem to be seeing a proper collaboration between Sony and AMD and an actual sort of coming together of technologies at this point, which kind of wasn't suggested to anything like the same degree before. Oliver, where do you want to begin on this? Because there's a lot of great stuff in here to talk about, right?
Well, Rich, I thought maybe we should go through this question by question just briefly, then perhaps we can talk about some grand conclusions at the end here. But this first question is kind of interesting. Basically, we're asking, PS5 Pro, RDNA 4, very different in terms of what they accelerate. Therefore, ergo, FSR4 and new PSSR, how do they differ? So basically, the answer there is that it's the same family of ML upscaler, but they have different hardware targets. They're not one-to-one matches for each other, but they produce similar visual output, which is kind of what we knew before, I feel like. But basically, the answer here and kind of...
As you guys already said, they're of the same family, of the same aspects. Like we were saying in some of those other videos before, FSR Redstone and new PSSR have somewhat different implementations due to the underlying hardware. Yeah, because you could do custom hardware on PC, where the Pro is just fixed. But the FSR upscaling uses 8-bit floating point, and PSSR uses 8-bit integer. The MAC counts, the amount of math involved, also vary a bit, and training data is similar, but not exactly the same. Or it has to be a little bit different because you have to design it for a console that's going to be a setting that everybody has, and it's a little bit different. But like you said, none of those factors above seem to make too much difference in results, as both Sony Interactive Entertainment and AMD have just released their refreshed models. It will be an excellent test of how closely we can match our systems. Yeah.
Between the lines here. With machine learning, oftentimes you can quantize certain data formats down to other data formats like FP8 to int4 or int8 and actually get very similar results. We see this with LLMs all the time. So it's not too surprising that with modern techniques and PSSR2 or new PSSR, you could actually get a pretty similar result to FSR4 with different data formats if you had sufficiently advanced engineering on the project. So for the end user, basically, I think the answer here is that FSR4 and PSSR, very similar results, have some implementation differences, but that shouldn't be that material to the end user. And at least from what we saw with FSR4 and RE Requiem, PSSR and FSR seem to match up very closely there. So basically everything you know about FSR4, you can mostly transpose that to PSSR and expect you're going to get a similar visual result, I would think.
There it is, guys.
Testing.
Yeah, it's also interesting that in terms of the actual training models, it's basically trained based on the upscaling factor, according to Mark Cerny here. So, he's literally saying if targeting a 2-to-1 fixed upscale, then the training data used is just for that upscaling ratio. and that different training results in different parameters. So I think, what's quite interesting about this is that we're starting to see some sort of view on how this is actually being created, which it's kind of like almost been black box technology before. It's like, here's our new upscaler, and you don't really know anything about how it was actually put together.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. But it's also interesting, I think, basically that the collaboration here between AMD and Sony is such that, Mark also talks about stuff that's happening in Redstone, like the frame generation technology, for example, that they've developed. That is also a part of Project Amethyst. So although we're seeing it first on PC, right, it's also co-developed, co-engineered, so to speak, with Sony as well, which is really, really cool. John, any initial thoughts based on this interview?
Yeah, I mean, I was going through a bunch of this stuff, and I guess one of the most important factors here is that they set, and this is a little bit later in the interview, but they set a specific goal of making sure that this was actually faster than the original PSSR implementation, and they did achieve that. He says 100 microseconds faster than the original. But that's very, very important, because that is very specifically, as he notes, the reason they were able to add the enhanced PSSR image quality option, right? And if it had been in any way even a little bit slower, that may have made that option something they wouldn't have added, right? Because they need to ensure compatibility with the full selection of PSSR titles. And I think that's actually a huge deal, because very specifically, and this is obviously something you can do on PC, right? You can force newer versions of DLSS and FSR in games, and you often want to, and it's the same deal here. So it really changes.
It is very PC-like in that respect, but it is very console-like in the sense that the level of QA here is a little bit higher. Like, they're trying to make sure that it's not exceeding a certain target in terms of the millisecond cost, and they're also making sure.
So they just said, it wasn't just about making the upscaler better, giving you better image quality, but they added other improvements, like he just told you about the 1,000 milliseconds improvement or whatever he said. I know what they're saying, though. That's kind of needed. And there's other things that are going to be talked about as well, too. It's pretty interesting. Hopefully they deep dive into this more. This is my first time fully looking at this like this, so I got to learn about it as well.
That the image quality is quite good relative to the old model, or else I presume they would not have implemented this toggle.
He did note some edge cases where, like, lighting and maybe like a couple scenes might cause some additional aliasing and such, and explains that's why this was made an optional feature, but that 99% of the time the results seem better in their testing.
Yeah,
I'm almost surprised, honestly, based on my own testing, although I don't want to spoil my content, obviously, which I think will be coming in the next week or so, but I'm kind of surprised based on.
So you saw that right there. Personally, I turned it in such a case, pretty much almost a 100% improvement across the board. That's major. Like, there's not much error there. It's basically just a positive boon for the whole gaming industry. Like, that's pretty awesome. So everything gets improved, like we were saying. Like, it's something they did a really good job with, and they worked very closely and very hard on it.
Visual results here, they didn't just toggle it on for all games, because I think there is a broad uplift in terms of image quality across console software and PS5 Pro.
I think adding it could be default, actually.
I think it could be default. Actually, the default behavior is to not have this enabled, which I find really curious. Maybe that's like a publisher thing. Maybe it's a QA thing. There are certainly good reasons to do that. But, I think the toggle, at least in this case, is good, because it's better to have the toggle in a global setting than a per game setting, because that really gets into the weeds. That's like the level of PC configurability that I don't like.
So Oliver was basically saying he thinks like they should have had the option to where you could have PSSR across everything as a backwards compatibility feature, like enhanced PS4 image quality for any game that was a PS4 game. Maybe there's a reason Sony didn't do that, because of maybe certain codings. I don't know. But that could be something interesting, and I wonder how they're going to do that with PS6.
Having a toggle where I can just tell PS5 Pro owners, hey, open up your PS5 Pro, go into the system settings, go into display output settings, click enhance PSSR image quality, and just leave it there, never touch it again. That is at least advice that I can give a console player.
Yeah, so imagine a setting, and he's right about that. Why wouldn't you? I said enhance PSSR image quality for all games. Like, if you were able to kind of like just put that into every game automatically. That would be cool. I guess that's a different type of, coding they got to do for that though.
It's fairly simple, that is not too intrusive, and that applies broadly across all games, instead of having to coach them through like, okay, well, in this game you do this, in this game there's this toggle in this, like it's a little bit, it's bringing that PC-like power, but I think with that console-like simplicity a little bit, even though I think they should have enabled the toggle by default.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, the concept of having a kind of like having to do a full new QA pass because of an option that you add to the system software, it's kind of like something that a console platform holder would do, quite rightly so. But at the same time, I do think there is a case for a kind of like here be dragons option. It should work, but if it doesn't, it's not our fault, sort of thing. John, I was quite interested to see that Mark actually calls you out, not in a bad way, but in a good way, when we were talking about the concept of how an upscaler's training and image quality presentation perhaps should be considered based on the context in which the games are played. On PC, it is typically like you're right in front of the monitor and you're quote unquote leaning in, whereas on a console you're sitting back. You're in the living room, so to speak.
It's a really important point, Rich. And the reason I think about that is because obviously, I have these two screens here. I'm looking at my PC monitor. It's a very large PC monitor, and I sit very close to it. But I use a 77-inch OLED behind me. I find that when I'm sitting in my normal chair, like image quality deficiencies are just far less noticeable from that chair. But then when I turn around and decide to capture a game and I'm viewing it full screen on my monitor here in close proximity, a lot of games just didn't hold up. And I realized, like, playing a lot of PC lately, it's very obvious, like, yeah, you could just get this, like, level of additional clarity on PC, even with similar input resolution targets that you weren't seeing on console with PSSR 1. And I do feel like PSSR 2 gets us much closer to actually matching that. Like, so when Alex was doing his comparisons with PSSR 2 versus other upscalers on PC for Resident Evil, right? Some people were like, oh, you're doing the zoom thing again, blah, blah, blah. That's actually good.
Yeah.
You were able to zoom all the way in, and the new PSSR actually holds up under scrutiny. That was the point Alex was trying to make, is that we're actually approaching a point now where it actually does start to look as good as great solutions on the PC side. So
he has some good points here about seeing those additional improvements in that spectrum, but also how Mark Cerny and AMD work together to give that same type of visual clarity and improvements on TVs where you're sitting farther away and not specifically like a PC that's only focused on monitor image clarity. Whereas like I'm using a certain type of monitor and it's run very good, but that's the thing that I don't think people understand when it comes to PSSR to PSSR2. Just in general, it's mostly designed around TVs because most console gamers do play on TVs. So there's improvements in the TV world.
Happy with this on a PC monitor in close proximity, I think is basically the key here, right?
Right.
I'm not sure if you guys agree. Like, I think it looks really good up close on a large monitor.
It does.
I think the question is whether the concept of it, there should be some sort of meaningful change in the way it's developed based on the fact that console gaming is usually done in a very different context to PC, but ultimately, surely good image quality is good image quality.
Yeah,
I don't know.
But I also think the basis for this question might be slightly getting off the wrong foot, because to what extent, I would rephrase it, to what extent was FSR4, or just this neural network in general, and this algorithm developed with console gaming in mind? Because FSR4, has a little bit of softness to the images, focusing on image stability. Perhaps there is actually a shared design goal, which is to produce a good upscaler for PC and consoles, and there's a bit of a matching, a bit of a compromise in terms of image quality characteristics,
right,
to meet them in the middle. I think that might be the case here, although Cerny is rather coy with his answer. He says it's an interesting concept. Perhaps that's something they did consider. I'm just speculating, of course.
It is tricky, though. You're right, Rich. Like, based on that, like, you're right. There is a difference in terms of how you use it. But I would argue that these days, more and more users are using their PlayStations in a closer screen environment, right?
Right.
Like a lot of users I've talked to, like, they have a very nice PC monitor that's also connected to their PS5. and that's
Yeah,
how
Yep, I
that's
got a
how they
4K
play.
PC monitor.
So, is there a way to do like right now? It's kind of one size fits all, but the use cases are slightly different, and I guess there is room to potentially alter that based on viewing distance and such. But yeah, tricky.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there was also a question, which I think we've actually muddied the waters slightly with the coverage. The question is the extent to which games are being patched and which are
Yes.
being addressed via the system level toggle. Now, when I specifically asked Sony during, this was like several weeks ago when we were doing the capture, it's like, okay, are these actually developer patches or is it all down to the system level toggle? And the impression I got was that it was specific patches that were being deployed, right? However, we've been pulled up on it, quite rightly so, by people saying, well, actually, I didn't have a title update for Alan Wake 2 or any of these other games. So, we have got a question that kind of addresses that. And basically, it looks as though the new system software is whitelisting the 11 titles that Sony announced, and that sort of substitutes into the new PSSR.
And that's separate from the toggle.
No, that is the toggle.
That is the toggle.
Isn't that what? I mean, it's still not.
Well,
quite
the
clear,
point
is
is
it?
like if it's like by default that toggle is off, right? Yet presumably these games are still working with enhanced PSSR.
Hold on. Okay, so going forth, a few titles will be patched. That patch will move to the new PSSR and simultaneously do some tweaking of the input data fed into PSSR. This is the best strategy when it's apparent from the broad QA that game side adjustments are needed for ideal image quality. Okay, I get what they're saying.
Enabling the toggle, I would think it just forces it on every title.
I think regardless of whether you have the toggle on or off, these titles will get the enhanced PSSR.
That's what I'm thinking.
QA'd for.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's kind of interesting.
So in case you guys were confused about what he was saying, he was talking about a custom PSSR 2 patch. You don't even need the toggle on for that. Like, for example, Resident Evil Requiem had PSSR 2 implemented, and that update was not out because they did a custom patch for it. So you don't need the toggle for that. It won't even make a difference because they maxed it out with that, or they have to just keep optimizing it. That's what they mean. That's the difference between that and the toggle for games that already have PSSR 1 on them.
I was actually curious about that, Rich, when you mentioned that, because Dragon Age the Veilguard in particular, that's the game I was thinking about, because it hasn't been patched in over a year. The team behind it was disbanded, and BioWare, a lot of the staff were laid off. So I'm like thinking, do they really have the bandwidth to ship a PSSR2 patch? Right? Is that actually a plausible path for them to go down? But I think this makes a lot more sense. Basically, they say, okay, the default behavior of PSSR2 is so good that maybe you just QA it and you whitelist it. Again, I'm kind of of the opinion they could probably just whitelist it for everything, or at least give us the toggle on for everything, right?
Yeah, give you the option.
But at least in this case, they have gone through, and some of the games in question are like some of the more egregious titles on the platform. I kind of wonder if Sony was reaching out to developers and saying, hey, Silent Hill 2, Konami, we need to sort this out. Like, we need to sort out Silent Hill F, we need to sort out Veilguard, that kind of thing. I kind of wonder what the direction of travel might have been on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Mark's also saying that a few titles will be patched. That patch will move to the new PSSR and simultaneously do some tweaking of the input data fed into PSSR. This is the best strategy when it's apparent from that broad QA that game-side adjustments are needed for ideal image quality. But he also says elsewhere in the interview that the existing inputs for the original PSSR, those are unchanged for the new PSSR. So I guess it's basically about just, tweaking the general data that is being fed within the established parameters there. Is there anything else you want to talk about here, Oliver? Anything that caught your eye?
Yeah, one other detail here, or two other details perhaps that I think are interesting that maybe we can walk through really quickly, which is our 8th question. Will the PSSR used for enhanced PSSR image quality change over time to the most recent version of the upscaler? Interesting question. I think that might have been one of mine. But basically, he's saying that they won't be changed over time. They will not be changed over time. It will remain this version. At least that's the current thinking. And I actually think that's a good idea, because as long as the improvements to PSSR are incremental and not categorical, then I kind of think you shouldn't mess with every game's visual output that uses PSSR every single time it's updated. Like, that kind of seems a little silly. It also means that you're going to have to commit to keeping PSSR costs under 2 milliseconds, right, for the indefinite lifespan of the machine in PSSR, which may be unwise depending on how PSSR develops. And it also makes our lives selfishly a bit easier because we won't have to like retest games and have the whole slate of games be updated every few months or however often with this enhanced PSSR image quality toggle updated. But if there is a huge model improvement, conversely, I feel like they should ship it. Like, I feel like there is a level at which you reach a certain threshold and say, hey, we're going to announce we're shipping PSSR 3 or upgraded and enhanced PSSR 2.0 or whatever they end up calling it, because the nomenclature will get confusing at some point. And they'll ship that out and they'll actually announce that, and that will be a big improvement. But I don't think they should, like FSR 4.2, 4.3, 4.4, whatever. I don't think that's necessary.
Yeah, a question I added was basically the extent to which new FSR technologies co-developed between Sony and AMD will actually make their way to PlayStation 5 Pro, right? Because obviously there's a great deal of R&D happening on FSR Redstone. Now we know about FSR Diamond. We can safely assume that Sony is intimately connected to practically every part of FSR at this point. So, what stuff will appear on the PlayStation 5 Pro and what stuff will be held back for whatever comes next, presumably PlayStation 6. So, nothing from Mark here in terms of like firm commitments, as you might expect. And all he's saying really is that there's going to be no more releases related to PSSR for the PlayStation 5 Pro this year.
That makes sense.
But they are, quote unquote, intimately familiar with FSR frame generation. And, I think it's fine to actually offer frame generation as an option to developers for PlayStation 5 Pro. I think it kind of makes sense. I don't see why you would hold that back. I mean, consider this. It's like, even if there is no anti-lag, I think I might have mentioned this on last week's Direct, but even if there is no anti-lag solution that would mitigate the cost of frame generation, you are actually already getting quite a lot of latency mitigation technologies by moving from 60 hertz to 120 hertz on your display, right? And then not running with VSync and instead moving into VRR, you claw back latency that way. So you should still get a smoother experience, not necessarily a more responsive experience, but certainly a smoother experience that would be kind of quite pleasing to the eye. Would you be on board with that, John?
Fully on board with that, provided it's used only for 60 hertz base titles. We don't need another Black Myth situation here. As long as the base input frame rate is high enough, I think it can produce quite acceptable results. 60 to 120, I think, is a perfect candidate for this and would be a huge thing for PS5 Pro, as it would essentially open the door to just like smoother motion across the board, and not just smoother motion, but also much cleaner image clarity, motion clarity, right, that you get from running at 120 frames per second. They would just have to ensure, I guess, it's because it's sort of a fixed style of output and there's not as many factors as PC, as long as they can find a way to ensure that the cadence of the frame delivery is smooth and consistent, which hasn't always been the case with the FSR frame generation, I think I'd be fully on board with it.
Yeah. To me, I think, though, there are two questions here. Number one, is FSR... is frame generation a viable technology for PS5 Pro? I would argue the answer is yes. I think you guys have documented why that is.
Yeah.
The second question is FSR MLFG a good solution for PS5 Pro? And I'd say there are some questions with that in terms of quality. There are some questions that Alex has documented, and there are some issues with various kinds of content. And then separately, there's also FSR 3FG, which we've seen integrated into a number of titles like Immortals of Avium, like The First Descendant, like Black Myth Wukong, somewhat infamously, with good results in some titles, like certainly Immortals of Avium, which I think was the first title with frame gen on consoles. Perfectly fine experience with VR at 120 hertz output, with a base frame rate of at least 40 FPS, pretty much in the content that I've seen. So I think there isn't as strong of an imperative to integrate machine learning based frame generation tech that is perhaps half baked and again has more limited applicability on the consoles than on PC, especially with HDMI 2.1 as the standard and 120 hertz as the standard output for high frame rate gameplay on consoles. And then also, like for other technologies like ray regeneration, I think we're currently seeing that ray regeneration in its current form, not that great. FSR Diamond form, maybe you want that, but maybe that's more of a conversation for PlayStation 6 than PlayStation 5 Pro. So I actually don't think that there's too much left in the AMD machine learning bin that you'd really want to pick out and polish off and put on PS5 Pro. I suspect those really exciting technologies beyond FSR4, beyond FSR Redstone, are really in the FSR Diamond category and not so much current generation technologies.
Yeah.
So there we have it, guys. This is the large chunk of the interview that was important. We got a lot of answers on what's going on with PSSR 2, what could possibly be happening with frame generation, what are the improvements beyond just visual clarity when it comes to PSSR 2 as well. And honestly, I think what Oliver just said made a lot of sense. I think the technology you're looking for when it comes to Redstone and Ray generation, obviously that's going to be PS6 specifically. But could they be working on it all year and then next year have frame generation drop for the Pro like in a light version? Possibly, but just straight 60 to 120, aspects. I think it's possible because he said not this year, but he didn't say it's never going to happen for the PS5 Pro. Most likely, you would just say for sure it's mostly for PS6, but could it be possible because the Pro could still be around for a few more years with GTA players? You never know. So I want you guys to let me know what you think about all the benefits that were shown here, what's going on, and also TV improvements, because that's something you have to work on because a PC developer, they're not really thinking about TVs, they're thinking about monitors. There's a lot of things that went into making PSSR 2, and then the 2 millisecond rule as well with the microseconds improvements. There's a lot of things going on here, and I can't wait to learn what else there is to know, what's going to be shared on this subject. As you guys know, I covered a lot of PSSR 2 topics on this channel. I wanted to fully cover everything and get as much out as I could. I've enjoyed it for sure, and I appreciate all y'all support. So as usual, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think. I'm very impressed with this. Like I said, when you think about the price point value that you get for a $750 machine and being able to get those type of results, yeah, it's impressive, and I'm happy that everybody gets to experience that. They aren't getting to experience it. So let me know what you guys think. As usual, leave a comment down below. Like I said, keep gaming no matter what platform you're on. Later, y'all.